The MREA presents the Rise Up podcast. Join the Midwest Renewable Energy Association at the MnSEIA Gateway to Solar Conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota on October 8th and 9th. Visit our booth to learn about accredited clean energy training, community resources, and solar group buy programs. While you're there, sign up as an MREA member to unlock exclusive benefits while supporting our mission of clean energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable living for all.
Welcome back to the Rise Up podcast. My name is Nick Hyla, the Executive Director of the Midwest Renewable Energy Association. And today we are joined by Logan O'Grady from MnSEIA. He's the Executive Director there. He also is a lobbyist for MnSEIA in Minnesota. Previously, he worked at Larkin Hoffman, where he served as an attorney on the firm's government relations team, representing solar companies at the state capitol and in front of the Public Utility Commission. He also served as the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at Clean Energy Economy Minnesota and the Committee Administrator for the Minnesota Senate's Powerful Capital Investments team. You have a law degree, a master's degree, and you're bringing a lot of that to work at MnSEIA. Logan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Good. Yeah, we are here to talk about policy in Minnesota, your work, some of the advancements, the future, and this upcoming conference, which is excellent. You guys put on the Gateway to Solar Conference in Minnesota. That's at October 9th and 10th in Minneapolis. So tell us about MnSEIA a little bit and your history and what you all do.
Yeah, well, just a quick note, our conference is October 8th and 9th. We switched it up this year because it was Monday, Tuesday that week, but now it's Tuesday, Wednesday. So I think that'll work a lot better for people flying in. So we'll get more on that later. But so MnSEIA, we are a 501c6 trade organization. We were established in 2009 because the industry here was basically non-existent. And those small entrepreneurs at the time thought we need a trade group to really go to the state capitol and help us establish public policies, legislation, and regulatory frameworks that are friendly to our new industry and can help us move solar forward. And so, at the time, it was really just a handful of small businesses that got together and established this new advocacy organization. Since then, we've grown to 170 members. We have different types of organizations that are members of ours. We have electric cooperatives, we have a couple state agencies, we have law firms, engineering firms, but really, our bread and butter of membership is solar installers and developers. So those companies that are actually building, constructing, and adding solar onto our grid here in Minnesota. Our goal is to move Minnesota solar forward, and we do that in a few different ways. First and foremost, as I mentioned, legislative advocacy. So we are at the state capitol every year trying to advance a legislative agenda that puts statutes into place that makes it predictable for companies to develop and install solar here. We also do regulatory advocacy work. So obviously, as a regulated state, Minnesota has a Public Utilities Commission that oversees all of our investor-owned utilities. We have 3 of them here in Minnesota. And we do work there because so much of our work is rolled into the work of utilities, right? And then we do public education work. So we try to get out into communities in Minnesota and share about the solar industry, the benefits that it brings to other communities in Minnesota in terms of job creation, tax revenues, and other things. And then, of course, as a trade organization, we do networking events. We have a quarterly member meeting. We do different things from pickleball to site visits. And of course, you mentioned our annual conference every year. To kind of wrap it up, we just really work hard on behalf of our 170 members to ensure that they have a predictable and stable business environment to develop and deploy solar.
Yeah, 170 members. That's great. And MnSEIA and your growth and your impact is really kind of indicative of the Minnesota solar market. I remember we actually at the MREA, with support from the U.S. Department of Energy, actually organized the first kind of annual policy conference, Solar Power in Minnesota, partnered with the budding organization of MnSEIA at that time. And since then, the growth has been impressive and dramatic, and the work that you do is ever growing and impactful, and the conference has expanded and improved. And a lot of that has to do with some of the major policy advancements in Minnesota over that time. So can you talk to us a little bit about how the solar market in Minnesota has come to be so robust.
I mean, we're so new. And that's, I think, what is just so shocking is the growth that you mentioned. So, in under 10 years, Minnesota went from basically 0 megawatts of solar to over a gigawatt. And that is really rapid growth. And we look back and we can really pin that growth trajectory to a couple different points in time. So in 2008, Republican Governor Tim Pawlenty, he passed legislation called the Next Generation Energy Act, which was really the state's first commitment to carbon reduction in Minnesota. It wasn't a requirement, it set out some goals, so there wasn't anything binding. But those goals really started the ball rolling. And then a few years later in 2013, the legislature supplemented that work with establishing Minnesota's community solar garden program, a small solar standard, and a couple of other things that really established that growth that we're talking about. So in Minnesota right now, we have about 1.9 gigawatts of solar, and of that, 890 is community solar. So about half of our solar in Minnesota right now is community scale solar. And so that can all be attributed to Melissa Hortman, who's now the Speaker of the House here in Minnesota, really understanding that to make progress that swiftly, you have to push utilities to do things. And she put that requirement of Xcel Energy to have a community solar garden program. So those are two significant things in the past. And then more recently, we're coming off a historic 2-year biennium here in Minnesota that I think we'll look back 10 years from now and say that was just another example of the legislature amplifying solar growth. So in 2023, the legislature came in very swiftly and passed 100% by 2040 carbon-free standard, where all utilities in Minnesota, every single one, even the small electric cooperatives and municipal utilities, must procure 100% of their energy from carbon-free sources by 2040. And that's 16 years away, right? So that's not a lot of time to do that. So it's one of the most, if not the most rigorous 100% standards in the country. And then they came in this year in 2024 and did kind of a 100% 2.0 and did an overhaul of our utility and transmission scale permitting reform to try and ensure that Minnesota can be on a timeline to meet those standards. But mixed within those two big policy proposals that ended up becoming law were a plethora of just different programs, funding, other requirements for small and mid-scale solar. So we completely revamped our community solar garden program, as I mentioned, which was the first community solar garden program in the country to really focus on low and middle income Minnesotans and remove geographic restrictions that were really holding that program back. We passed a new distributed solar energy standard, which requires our investor-owned utilities, all three of them, to meet a certain percentage of their energy procurement in mid-scale DG, so like 10 megawatts and under. We passed a Solar for Schools program, which has put Minnesota 13th in the nation for solar deployment on schools. Because that was so successful, they came back the next year and passed a solar on public buildings bill, historic $50 million investment for our solar incentive program called Solar Awards. We created a storage incentive program. We did a storage study to see how much storage the state needs to meet those 2040 goals I mentioned. We stopped HOAs from banning solar. And then this year we did a lot of work on interconnections. We're moving to, rather than a cost-causer method of grid upgrades, more of a cost-sharing program. And that's just mentioning like the purely MnSEIA work. There's a bunch of other stuff, a green bank, this Energy Alley stuff to invest in upcoming and thriving businesses, electric grid resiliency grants. So just this last year was kind of, the Speaker of the House calls it like a shock and awe moment for Minnesota. I mean, they just passed so much investments and policies that are really going to help our industry and the clean energy industry more broadly just really thrive.
Yeah, it's truly been impressive. I think nationally maybe overlooked, probably the most forward-leaning like sweep of policies that at least I've seen. And the interesting thing about it, I want to dig into the community solar gardens a little bit more, but maybe you could talk about this a little bit. One of the interesting things I see in Minnesota is you had Governor Pawlenty, who's a Republican. He passed some legislation that really looked at reducing carbon. It was voluntary, but still like pretty impressive. Then you had this like Democratic sweep, this 2013 Solar Energy Jobs Act, and that was really just all Democrats voted for that one, but because some of the provisions in that bill were so economically beneficial, This next round of legislation had attracted bipartisan support, for example, a Solar on Schools program. And I think that's a really impressive part of what's happened in Minnesota. You want to talk about some of the work that went into that, your perspective on, getting both sides to vote on something that tends to be so polarizing in other states?
Yeah, I mean, I think we still have work to do there, right? And I do talk about that, how like Tim Pawlenty was really a Republican, as you mentioned, was really the first one to make this an issue in Minnesota. And it's because he recognized the economic value of supporting a nascent industry and the growth opportunity for Minnesota. And I also think that he is part of that sector of that party that does understand that we should leave this world a better place than we had it when we were responsible for it. And that's just like a Minnesota belief, right? We have the boundary waters up north, and we're really proud of our lakes and our outdoors. And so it has been a little bit disappointing to see some on the political right kind of fall off the wagon a little bit. But I think we are making progress, as you mentioned, and there are certain specific examples. So like you mentioned, Solar for Schools, we did a pilot of that at first, and it was so popular, and school districts in greater Minnesota benefited so much from it, not just the economics from cutting down their utility bills at their schools and their school districts then saving money, and then, taxpayers then saving money, but also just the new educational opportunities. So our Solar for Schools program requires schools that participate to use it as a learning opportunity for their students, and showing students that there is a relatively new sector in our state's economy that you could work in. And if you like being outdoors, it's a great option for you. So it was just a matter of piloting it first and proving that it could be successful. And then again, when greater Minnesota, which is largely, Republican members of the legislature, see that and hear that from their school districts, that's how they buy in. So that, is a specific example. But I think there was bipartisan support of permitting reform too, because that's a really great message for Republicans then, and you kind of got to meet them where they're at sometimes, right? Of cutting red tape and streamlining processes for businesses. And that's, I think, how that was all accomplished, is we just met them where they're at and had talking points that resonated with them. And I think it was a pretty good strategy.
Yeah, and hopefully that that can continue in Minnesota. I know it's tough during a national election cycle to maintain the bipartisanship, and your governor sure has been lifted to a national profile. But sometimes you just got to keep your head down and keep working, right? On a policy-specific note, one thing that Minnesota has really been known for is this 0 to 800 megawatts of community solar in a decade, and that's not just like bought, but built and operating. And that all came out of this first legislation in the Minnesota Solar Energy Jobs Act passed in 2013. And then what I really kind of want you to address, though, is lessons learned and what came out of this last legislative session and where the market sits in your perspective on it.
I mentioned the Community Solar Garden Program a little bit at the beginning, and we are in a place of being the first, right? And that's always tough. And you have to get some information and data about a program, and you might have to make changes. And that's, what we did in Minnesota. We recognized, and there were some advocacy groups concerned about who was really benefiting from the Community Solar Garden Program. I think if you actually dig down into the details of it, it was a very public interest program. You had a lot of local governments that subscribed, a lot of school districts, a lot of nonprofits and other organizations. But you always have kind of this case of like, you need this like backup subscriber that is oftentimes a specific company. And so we really revamped it last year in 2023 to make sure that we were focusing on the target audience for that program, right? So the reason that community solar was created to begin with was that there was this recognition that the only people that could buy into solar or the clean energy transition were those that could afford it, had a home with a large enough roof, sited perfectly, and could finance solar projects themselves, right? And that's not every Minnesotan, that's not every American. And so this new program was created where you could, with your neighbors, buy into a community solar project, and you don't have to have it on your roof, usually within the community or within the utility territory. And so that was the whole genesis of that program. But we just had to make sure that that was what we were truly doing. So in 2023, we refocused. We have low and moderate income requirements in that program now. We have public interest requirements on top of that. That program is just getting off the ground running, that new program. But in this first kind of set of applicants to that program, 60% are low income and another 15% are underserved communities. So we're already talking about 80% of that new program is completely underserved Minnesotans and communities. So it's succeeding in its revamp, at least so far, and we'll see what the data comes. But you talk about lessons learned. I do tell people in states, that reached out to me and asked, because Minnesota, as I said, we were the first ones. People look to us for a lot of, examples. And I just say, do be careful what you wish for, because this can cause a lot of division. Going from 0 to 900 megawatts of solar in 8 years or whatever it was is a lot. And there's a lot of now congestion on our grid because the utility has not been able to keep up with that demand, and the capacity has been restricted and constrained. And there needs to be a lot of grid upgrades now to expand the capacity for not just more community solar, but more distributed solar in general. And so I think what I always tell states when they ask me is like, make sure you're planning in advance for the expansion of your distribution grid while you're growing your community solar garden, and maybe ramp up your community solar garden slowly rather than just kind of like 0 to 60 like we did.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about this planning piece. And I'm very curious on your take here. But at the time when the community solar garden law was passed, you also passed this required value of solar study in Minnesota because, like we have this problem, Wisconsin, a lot of states have it, where the utilities just blanketly say like, oh, your solar is subsidized by all the ratepayers because when you put solar on, you buy less electricity and we have to recover our costs. So it's like a subsidy. Whereas solar delivers all these benefits, right? And what you guys required in Minnesota was like, okay, in front of the Public Service Commission, let's use data. Let's use a methodology. Let's figure out how much the solar is worth. And at the time, what I really thought was, every public utility commission should do that, should get data. And because what the goal of the commission is kind of reliability and affordability. And they have to get on this kind of like lowest cost resource. And we know that the fuel costs for solar are free, and it generally produces on peak, and it avoids transmission and distribution and all of this stuff and capacity investments. But here you sit now, like now you have 900 megawatts of solar, you got grid congestion, and you're in this planning phase where you're like, where do we need the capacity additions? Are you rejecting DG applications because you just don't want any, or because there's no room? How is this conversation going? What lessons have been learned there, and what do you see as kind of the vision of this kind of like planning, more detailed planning?
That's a big question. I mean, I think I'd first start off and just remind people that a shift by utilities to recover rates to ensure their profit is not a subsidy, right? Like that shift, if any, is happening because utilities want to profit, right? It's not because solar costs more. One of the problems in our community solar garden program is we didn't have the value of solar when it passed. So there was this introductory stage of a few years, because it took, I think, 2 years to go through the rulemaking process to establish the value of solar. So in that 2-year period, there needed to be an introductory rate for whatever a community solar subscriber was being credited on their utility bill, right? And that introductory rate was the applicable retail rate, which was quite a bit higher. And it was done that way too, to also incentivize early adopters, right? When you have a new program, you need to really make it economically beneficial for them to make such an investment. And so it was intentionally higher, and it was put in place as an introductory rate until the value of solar was established and stood up and implemented. And so when our utilities and other groups complain about the cost of community solar, they're really talking about that introductory rate, which is the biggest cost in that program right now, because it is just a higher bill credit rate. And those contracts were signed for 25 years when the solar gardens that use the ARR were built. When the value of solar then was created through this public rulemaking process, and then it started to go into effect, it was lower than that introductory rate. And it is disappointing now looking back, because in the new program, we've kind of gotten rid of the value of solar. And I think the value of solar was a really elegant public way of determining what is the actual economic value of this distributed energy resource to the grid. Because as you mentioned, it looked at a number of different elements, including like, what are we offsetting in other energy procurement technology that we would have to build, construct, and maintain, that we're now offsetting because of solar, and what is the carbon impact. So there were a lot of things that were great about the value of solar. What wasn't great about it is that it was confusing, right? Like, you had to follow along at the PUC on all this stuff, which nobody is great at following anything at the PUC except those of us who are hired to do it, right? And so it confused a lot of people, and it was a really great way for the utilities to confuse lawmakers and say, this value of solar doesn't exist anywhere else in the country at the time, and it's expensive. And so that led to kind of us eliminating it for the purposes of the new program. The methodology still exists and can still be calculated. I'm hoping that someday we can go back to it and say this was actually the best way to do it. That's kind of where we're at right now with that.
Often it's a process question, isn't it? We always want stuff to happen so quickly, and and that hindsight is really sticking to this process. And I hope that, like you, that can be redone, because it really is kind of leading into some of your future issues. And I'm going to start picking issues that you're highlighting in the Gateway to Solar conference agenda. One of the first ones I see, and like your headline keynote speaker, is Bernadette, who's the ED of the California Solar and Storage Association, kind of like probably had been the biggest solar energy industries association in the country for a long time, drove the solar market, and they are a leading indicator, right? They are what goes in California happens to the rest of the country. And the title of her talk is The California Solar Coaster, Lessons Learned Around Net Metering Reform. Just to kind of like prime you up here about kind of how MnSEIA is thinking about this, for those listeners who haven't been following, California, they had a really smart incentive program for distributed generation solar adoption that led to a lot of solar deployment in California. Well, at some point, you reach this point where solar becomes less and less valuable because there's so much of it. And I'm guessing if California could go back in time, they would probably start installing energy storage earlier than they did now to deal with their load in the afternoon, which is they're doing an amazing job right now. Most energy storage that's being deployed in the country is in California. So when it comes to your work in Minnesota, you talked about some of the storage studies happening. Like, what are you thinking about now in the future? How are you anticipating this work in Minnesota?
I'm excited for that conversation at our conference with Bernadette, because I do just want to ask her, like, what happened, right? I mean, California was the model forever about, how do we implement and incentivize solar through net metering, and how do we protect, customers' rights to go solar. What happened because of the result of, net metering 2.0, which is what they called it, I think, in California, or, net metering reform, where they cut the rate, right, for residential systems, it led to the largest green jobs loss in the history of that state. That change of going from just being, the model for everybody else to now being like, let's not do that, is just quite shocking. And I'm really excited to have a conversation with her about that, because I want to know, how do we avoid that here in Minnesota? Because there are states that are doing this better than California, rather than just kind of pulling the rug out. They're really being more thoughtful of it. I'm thinking of like Massachusetts, for example. I thought that maybe someday in this role I would be having fights about net metering, but I honestly thought it was like a decade away. But now, because of, as you mentioned, what California does, the rest of the nation eventually does, it seems like. Now we have Minnesota lawmakers and we have other people saying, like, maybe we should look at net metering reform here in Minnesota, even though Minnesota is so far away from penetration of solar that California is. Minnesota lawmakers in particular like to think ahead. And so we are worried about this topic coming up during the legislative session, where we might be defending and saying, we have net metering in statute right now. It's working. But yes, I guess we do need to think ahead. And so that's why we established the storage incentive program for small storage paired with a PV system. That's just going online now. I just actually saw over the last couple of days, some of our members are advertising that incentive program to try and get more people to adopt batteries. But here's the thing. In Minnesota, we have no battery tariff. We have no rate structure around what it would look like if you own a battery paired with a PV system and you deploy that at, let's say, peak demand time for the utility. What do you get compensated? There's nothing that says what that is. And so we need a lot of policies in place to help with that as well. It's not enough just to say, like, here's an upfront grant to help with your storage installation. You also need to incentivize people to continue to have those and maintain batteries, right? It's an asset that you're adding to your home. So that is something we've been working on for a number of years, is, some sort of battery discharge program or peak shaving tariff or something like that. One thing that also can, not just DER storage, we also need utility scale storage too. And that's why we did this storage study. Is now we have a 2040 goal. The utilities need to meet by 2040, 100% carbon free. And there has to be storage implemented into that in some way. So a study came out in February saying, the utilities in Minnesota need to procure between 1,300 and 2,800 megawatts of storage to meet those 2040 goals. And so we're looking at this next legislative session, whether we have a storage standard now in Minnesota. You did mention California would have implemented storage earlier, but it's just such a new technology. It didn't even exist when California started deploying solar. So it's just so new. And like anything else, when something's new, you kind of got to get it out there a little bit, and then you kind of come in with the regulations and the rules later. So that's what we're looking at.
Well, there is a benefit of being a laggard, right?
Right.
And you mentioned two things that I'd have you follow up on. Kind of the first is that's really exciting that Minnesota is doing the solar potential study and actually has a storage incentive out, because that is a pilot phase, right? You are in this pilot phase of experimentation. And you also mentioned Massachusetts, which I think they have a great model for a program in this Clean Peak Standard and the Connected Solutions program, which has been incredibly effective in like a bring your own device program aimed at just cleaning up the peak. Are you looking at that program when you're thinking about policy in Minnesota? Is that kind of some of the inspiration you're taking?
That is what we looked at first when we implemented the storage incentive program. But as you mentioned, lawmakers, they don't like to just give money away generally, right? I know that some people think that they do, but they like proof that something's going to work. And so that storage incentive program only got, I think, 2 to 3 million in the first 2 years. And that's going to go by pretty quick. And so what we need right now that program is now up and running, we need success stories from that. And we need to be able to show that if you have this as an option for Minnesotans, they will utilize it, and it will be used to the benefit of the utilities as well as other ratepayers and other utility customers. So that's what I'm really looking out for as this program gets off the ground. And then, like you're saying, how do we come back and either add money and funding to it, and how do we tweak it to work better? And so it's really kind of like most of our policy initiatives, a multi-year effort where sometimes you just got to prove yourself first,
Yeah, pretty exciting times though. Success breeds success. So the fact that some of these policies that have been a little forward-leaning in Minnesota have proved so successful gives you this opportunity to try something new and learn from others. I'm going to pivot a little bit here, and because some of the storage conversation, especially in this difference between domestic capacity currently and the domestic capacity we want to have to kind of meet some of these domestic content requirements in the IRA, there's a big question there. Can we build things in America? Like, this is this big national question that we're asking ourselves. And in Minnesota, you have this really interesting context, some history there with Minnesota Made. You do have a domestic in-state manufacturer of solar, and the Iron Range and the politics around the Iron Range and that like political block and that mining capacity in Minnesota. And I see again at the Gateway Conference, you have another keynote here from Julie Lucas, who is the executive director of Mining Minnesota, talking about this kind of like, how are we striking this balance here, and where are we at in Minnesota? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think the overall conversation of mineral procurement in the clean energy industry is not a Minnesota unique thing, right? But I think what is unique is Minnesota is home to so many of those minerals in our grounds. And as you mentioned, we have the Iron Range up in northern Minnesota, and mining has been an extremely vital part of our state's history for so long. And so I think that is unique because not many other states have that, right? And so my opinion is Minnesota is the perfect place to have this discussion because we have an industry here that is directly impacted by this issue. And so we've had Julie and a couple other mining advocates at our panel or at our conference for the last couple of years. It's always one of the most popular topics because I don't think people, especially here in Minnesota, know what to think. Obviously, solar inherently is an environmentally friendly industry. A lot of our members started their businesses, right, because they had this fundamental belief in environmental stewardship. And then mining has been painted as this anti-environment thing for so long, but at the same time, they need each other in a weird way, right? Because right now, we're not recycling enough panels because we're not in Minnesota anyway. Those panels really started going in 2016, 2017. We're not even close to the end of their life cycle yet. So we're not even recycling enough to reuse it to build what we need to meet the demand of today and the future. And so we need to procure new minerals. And so I think people love attending that panel. And I think we'll see a lot of people interested in the topic again this year because it's a controversial issue in some ways. And it's just like, we don't know the right answer. If we are, 10 years down the road and we realize we don't have enough product to meet the demand that is existing, I think that there will be a lot of mining happening and they're going to expedite it. And maybe they're going to leave out environmental requirements and oversight that they shouldn't be. And so I think it's important that we don't get ahead of ourselves on this issue and we're really being thoughtful about it. If people come to the conference, I think it's definitely a keynote to attend for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely that opportunity for alignment, right? There is this sweet spot. And we, of course, see some, we are, let's be honest, we're kind of a NIMBY nation, not in my backyard. So there's just a lot of, even in Wisconsin, we have big solar farms. So around me, there's a lot of people that don't even like solar because the farms are too big. And so I think that is a really exciting and interesting conversation. And, and you mentioned recycling too. And it's just like all the kudos to Minnesota. I was invited to be on the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's PV panel recycling working group because it was required by legislation that Minnesota have a plan in place and advanced policies for recycling and getting ahead of the game. And so I think that there's this opportunity not to have just one or the other, but to have both, right? To be able to support domestic mining and manufacturing and also be making sure that you're capturing all of those minerals before they hit the landfills.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much more here that you have in the Gateway to Solar Conference.
I think our conference is unlike a lot of other conferences around the country because we do all of the work in-house. We don't have an events company. I mean, we have an events company that helps us execute the event, but we don't pass that off to a private events company who profits from it. We do it ourselves. I come up with the agenda myself. I add all the speakers in myself. We are really involved in the execution of it. And so I think if you come to our conference, you're really going to feel like it's a family reunion, frankly, because it's like everybody that we all know and love within our industry in one place over a 2-day period, talking about, yes, of course, what's happening in Minnesota and what's important, but also regionally and nationally, how does Minnesota fit into that? And how can other states learn from us? And how can we learn from other states? It's one of our really important events throughout the year for an organization, for a number of reasons, obviously funding, but also it's a way for us to get together with our industry and talk about the future and talk about the past and what we can learn from the past and what's going on. And this year we're offering some workshops, which is 101 workshops, because we've gotten some feedback that sometimes you need to be a person that's been in the industry for a long time to understand what's going on. So we're offering something for those young people within our industry that are just getting started to learn about interconnection 101. Diversity, equity, inclusion is an important part of our conference this year. And we have a workshop on that and what the industry is doing and can do to be better in that. And of course, we have 110 speakers over 36 different panel topics. So it's a big 2-day event and we're really proud of it. And it's a labor of love for sure. It's October 8th 8th and 9th, and people can go to our website to learn about that. In terms of topics at this year's Gateway to Solar Conference, you mentioned a couple. I mentioned a couple. We talk a lot about what happened the last biennium, but we also are going to talk about what the future has to hold. And I think as we look as an industry and as an organization on what our future priorities are going to be, you mentioned panel recycling. I know there will be legislation in 2025 around that. And I think there was a recent article in Minnesota about wind turbines just sitting in a field, and you could literally see them from a satellite in space. That's not a good look for the wind industry for sure, but that makes us look bad too, because now everybody's thinking like, well, when is solar going to be the next one that does this? And although we're kind of not quite there yet on the need for recycling in Minnesota, in my opinion, I think that the more proactive we can be about that, that makes us all look better. And I know lawmakers want to be proactive, and they definitely don't want this clean energy transition to harm communities, right? It's supposed to help people. You mentioned energy storage. I mentioned energy storage. That's just going to continue to grow, and I think be a really important piece of this whole clean energy transition. Like any industry, within our state or within the country, there's always examples of bad actors or people that aren't doing the right thing, right? And as solar continues to grow, it's becoming more important that we're ensuring that consumers are safe and protected in that industry and to thrive and make investments. And so I think there will be some consumer protection legislation that I know our parent organization, MnSEIA, has been working on, and we're going to look at what we can do here on the Minnesota level for that. Agrivoltaics has been around for a while, but it's growing in popularity, and I think there can be some adjustments and even just simple definitions of like what is agrivoltaics, so that we can get approval for certain permitting and other things from the Department of Agriculture, and maybe even get more local adoption of solar. You mentioned in Wisconsin, and I know I have an aunt that lives in southwestern Wisconsin. They don't love solar there, but maybe they would if there were requirements to use agrivoltaics that benefit surrounding farms in terms of pollinators and other things. What else? Minnesota doesn't have a solar tax credit. Places like Iowa do. And I'm like, if Iowa has it, why doesn't Minnesota have it, right? And so we're looking at that. We talked about pilots and how those can be really good, tools for implementing more permanent legislation. We piloted some solar on landfills legislation a few years ago, and we finally got through kind of the barriers on where the first project in that is going to go forward. And so I'm thinking of trying to add to that and see what else can we be doing on maybe not just like landfills, but even, closed mining sites or other pieces of land that might not have a lot of other uses because of certain environmental protections or whatever. And so that's something we're looking at as well.
Yeah, all those stuff from brownfields to bright fields, consumer protection, storage, mining, recycling, all of it. I'm just going to reinforce how great I think you all do at that conference. They do an amazing job. I will be there if you are at all interested in solar and all of the related opportunities there. Go to the MnSEIA conference in Minneapolis. It's at the airport. Where's it at? Where's the location?
Yeah, we try to mix it up here and there. This will be our second year at the Intercontinental Airport, which is connected to the MSP Airport, or you can take a small shuttle from Terminal 2. So yeah, it's right there if people want to fly in. It's always easy thing to do.
Great. 8th and 9th, I'll be there. I will see you there. Logan, thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing all your knowledge. Don't want to keep you from your day job because it's really important. So I will see you in a few weeks at the Gateway to Solar Conference. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.